Well, as you've seen on our video, we're going to be diving into the life of Abraham a little bit more this week. My name is Jonathan. If I haven't had a chance to meet you, I look forward to chatting with you hopefully soon. Over the years, in my family, I've had the privilege of reading a lot of bedtime stories to my kids and even to some other people's kids over the years as well. And in the interest of full transparency, if my kids had not just left, they would tell you this and they would want me to tell you this. I am by far the secondary reader that they would pick. They would always choose my wife, Erin, because as they said and reminded me even this morning, I don't do the voices well enough. Everybody sounds the same. And then I do occasionally fall asleep while reading a story. It happens. It works. Well, sadly, our kids are getting to the age where we don't do this as often anymore. And so that does make us a little bit sad. But when that was part of our daily routine, there was a few things that I looked for that made a really good bedtime story. Like some of my favorites, maybe some of you know Llama Llama, Red Pajama, the Stanley books, maybe The Day the Crayons Quit as they get a little bit older. Those are some favorites that we would read over and over and over again. And then there were some that like disappeared after one reading and we just couldn't find it the next time. I don't know where it went. Just went missing. Well, what makes a great bedtime story, a great story really, is you need to have a compelling character that the kids and the adults both kind of relate to and want to hear more about. You need a story that has a problem. Something needs to be resolved, right? And the final thing, and maybe this is just what a tired dad wants, is you want a story that resolves neatly with no loose ends at the end, okay? The last thing you want when the story ends is a bunch of lingering questions, existential angst, cliffhanger endings. That's for a different age, for adults, whatever. We don't with kids, you want a peaceful ending and they want the lights to go out, right? And in fact, there's something that we've become very accustomed to with some kinds of stories for how they end. And you can probably, once I start saying it, you'll probably know exactly what I'm about to say. And they lived happily ever after the end. It's a great way for a story to end. And even whether it's a child or whether it's an adult, when it's a grown-up book or movie or show, we like a story that wraps up with a happy ending. And I think part of the reason, even especially as an adult, is that I like those kind of stories is, well, real life so rarely is simple and clean. And so having a story that just kind of ties it all together feels really good. Well, sometimes that's how we approach the Bible. We approach the Bible like it's a fairy tale. And there's a lot of normal reasons that we might think about that, like because it takes place in a very different time and a place to what we live in. It might fall into a category of stories to us that feel nice, but feel pretty disconnected from our real life. And I want to kind of blow that up for two reasons if you take something away today. The first important reason why the Bible is not like a fairy tale is that we see in the Bible that there is a multitude of historical evidence that says that this is a true story about God's people that took place in real people's lives, in real times, and in real places. So we would say, hey, it's not just make-believe. And the second point that's really more about what we're going to deal with today is that while we may think that like fairy tales and bedtime stories deal with things that don't come up so much in the Bible actually deals with the stuff of our real lives. It often brings up the things that, yes, it took place maybe 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, but it also is things that we continue to deal with in our lives today. And so our story today is one of those that kind of shows how to live when life inevitably doesn't just resolve with an easy, happily ever after. So last week, Petey started us off in Genesis chapter 12. We'll do a little bit, kind of a review, a little pulling some pieces forward from that. So if you have your Bibles, you want to turn to Genesis chapter 12. We're going to get to verse 9 and 10, but it's on page 15 of the Pew Bible if you want to pull that out. And one thing to note is you may notice that your Bible is going to say Abram, and I'm going to read Abram, but when I talk about him, for the most part, I'm going to get this right. I'm going to say Abraham. And not to give too much away for the story, but his name gets changed by God in Genesis chapter 17. And that's how most of us think about him and know him. So I'm going to try to call him Abraham throughout, but just know that when we read it, it'll be Abram. So in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 4, we read that Abraham was called by God to leave his country and his people and his father's house behind to go to a new place to receive God's blessing. And that God was going to set in motion through Abraham a plan to not just bless Abraham's family, but truly to bless all of the families of the earth. And in verse 4, we get what might feel like a nice little bow on Abraham's story. We get a tidy ending. It says, "So Abram went as the Lord had told him." Great. We could just kind of end it right there. Maybe it would have a little bit of a line like, "And he lived happily ever after in the promised land with his big, large family," the end. But that's not what we get. And I'm really glad that's not what we get, because that's not the kind of things that we often face in our own lives. We instead get a story that we see what happens when the heat and pressure of life collides with what Abraham, the promises that he's received, and him trying to live that out. We see that God's promises often take root in our lives and take root in our hearts as we have to walk through difficult things, as we have to walk through circumstances from the outside that hit us and are really difficult. We get to see in this passage how much God's promises have taken root and how deep those roots are in Abraham's life. And I think it's going to help us as we think about our own. There's a Bible scholar I read this week was writing about this passage, and he said this. He said, "Faith is not that easy. Faith is always a battle. Even Father Abraham must struggle for faithfulness." Maybe a lot of you feel like that and can relate to that. So Genesis 12, we're going to start, if you want to pick back up, we're going to read in verse 10 here in a second. And as we look at this, I want to give you like a little pattern that I think might be helpful as you try to read this story and pay attention to what's going on. So this is something I came up with. It's not perfect. We're workshopping it. We're still trying this out here. I'm calling it the circle of trust or distrust. Okay, circle of trust or distrust. So what we see is that God has given Abraham some promises. We saw those back in the beginning of chapter 12. And we're going to see those kind of lived out a little bit in our story. But then some pressures hit Abraham's life. So I want you to pay attention. What are those pressures? What happens in his story? It won't take long for that to happen. And then I want you to pay attention to what is Abraham's reaction. What does he do as a result of that problem that he faces? And does he act out of faith in God, or does he act out of fear? Pay attention for that. And then what's the impact on what Abraham does on himself, those around him, and even a wider world as well. So we'll see kind of this play out. And why I think this is helpful is that I can't emphasize this enough. Abraham's story and the one we're looking at today, it's going to feel really distant from things that you've experienced. I don't think most of us have had a situation like this take place. But I can guarantee you that you have lived, are living, and will continue to live out this cycle and circle of learning to trust and walk out of faith in God's promises. This will happen over and over and over again in our life. And I think it's something we can learn from. All right, so verses 9 and 10. We read, "Then Abram set out and continued toward the Negev. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe." So Abraham arrives in the land God promised, and right away there's a famine. Means there's no food. And this is a kind of world where it's an agricultural world. And so if you don't have food, you can't feed livestock, you can't grow crops. There isn't a Costco to go and just stock up. That's not how that works. And so I liken this and what Abraham might have felt to. If you've ever had a hotel or an Airbnb and you arrive in your room and you look around and you think, this doesn't look anything like the photographs that I saw online. They didn't just hire an excellent photographer. It was just like a magician took these pictures. I'm looking at something totally different. I think that's how Abraham probably felt when he got to the promised land. Like, God, you wanted me to come here and there's no food? Like, what was the plan here? Famine was a life or death issue. And so Abraham immediately starts to think, what do I do about this problem? So notice what he doesn't do right away. He doesn't pray. He doesn't worship. He doesn't call upon God. That's not mentioned in this story at all. He doesn't wait on the Lord. He goes into fix-it mode. Anybody else have a fix-it mode? Maybe a lot of male hands getting raised, but we all do that. Well, Abraham interprets this famine immediately as a sign that maybe God is unwilling or unable to take care of him. And so he decides to leave the promised land pretty much as soon as he puts his tents up, and he goes south to Egypt. And Egypt was a place where they were less reliant on rainfall for crops to grow because the Nile River annually floods and kind of makes a natural irrigation system for Egypt. And so there was going to be food down there. So Abraham and his family head that direction. Well, on the way to Egypt, maybe before he left, it occurs to Abraham, hey, I'm actually walking into a pretty precarious situation. You see, Abraham would be a foreigner coming in great need with kind of very little to offer in the situation. And he's going to be walking into a foreign nation that has their own concerns and needs, and this foreign power probably has no reason to treat Abraham well. He is a resourceless man walking into a very ruthless kingdom and empire. So he hatches a plan. This is how he's going to make things work. So we read in verse 11, as Abraham was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, and her name changes too, so Sarah is what we know her as. He says to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but will let you live. So say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. Like I said, I told you this is probably not a situation you've ever encountered in your life. Now, wives, you might think, well, what a nice thing. He's trying to say how beautiful his wife is, but it's followed by something that is very selfish and puts her in this very terrible position, right? If you think back for a moment, the promise that Abraham and Sarah had received from God was a promise that God was going to make Abraham's family into a great nation and that they were going to be a blessing to the other families of the world. And yet here, instead of thinking about his family and instead of protecting and cultivating this family, Abraham is clearly only looking for his own skin. What does he say? He says, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. Abraham's treating his wife Sarah like she's a bargaining chip, and he puts her in a really vulnerable and dangerous position as a result. So what happens when they get down to Egypt? Well, verse 14 says, when Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And she was taken into his palace. And he treated Abram well for her sake. And Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. So Abram was correct. Sarah was desired by those in power, but maybe he even underestimated how much, because it wasn't just another wealthy individual. It wasn't some person who was a middle government official who was interested in Sarah. It was Pharaoh himself. This is the king over all Egypt, and there was no disobeying Pharaoh in Egypt. Pharaoh had all of the power and did not have to ask or say please. He could do whatever he wanted. And so Pharaoh comes calling for Sarah, and as a result, Abraham receives a great riches as kind of like a bride price as in exchange for Sarah becoming one of Pharaoh's wives. And you'll notice here that some of the things that Abraham gets as his riches in this moment are going to come back up later in our story. So, in a few weeks, we're going to come to a part of a story where we talk about a woman named Hagar. We preached on her about a year ago during Advent because she's one of the women that comes up throughout the story and like lineage of God's people in the Old Testament. And here, she would have been probably one of the female maidservants that Abraham and Sarah are receiving as part of this exchange. And so she enters the story here because of Abraham's scheme of trying to figure out a way of surviving. So though Abraham had forgotten God's promise when he faced the fearful prospect of famine and the power of Pharaoh in Egypt, God didn't forget his promises. God was going to intervene in the situation to protect Sarah, to preserve the blessing of his family line before it's even gotten started. And he is going to bless the whole earth through Abraham's family. And so here's what happens. In verse 17, we read, "But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife, Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. 'What have you done to me?' he said. 'Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go.' Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had." So Abraham was supposed to be a conduit of blessing. That wherever he went, him and his family were going to be blessed by God to be a blessing to others. And the first place that he goes, the first family that he comes in contact with outside of his own, the first nation that he's around other than his own, instead of bringing blessing, he brings curses. And it's actually Pharaoh who points that out in this story, right? Abraham leaves Egypt with his wife and in great wealth, but this scene really reveals that there's a gap. There's a gap between what Abraham believes and how he's living, or between the promises Abraham has received from God and how he's living them out. When faced with the difficult circumstances in life, Abraham turned inward rather than looking upward. And this isn't just an Abraham problem, is it? When the heat and pressure of life increase on us, how do we often respond? Who do we turn to, or what do we turn to? Well, I don't know about you, but when I'm faced with difficult circumstances in life, our tendency, I think, is too often to look inward rather than upward. And so what I want to do now is maybe pull some things from Abraham's story that could help us, instead of walking in that cycle of distrust, but how to walk by faith, maybe in the cycle of trust in what God has for us. So the first thing that I want you to see kind of pulling out of this story is that we see that following God was not a guarantee for Abraham that he would avoid trouble and hardship. Okay, so we spent some time this past spring preaching through a series where we looked at an idea of the already and the not yet. That we live in an in-between time between Jesus' first coming and his second coming. And in the midst of that, we know that Jesus' death and resurrection has secured our ultimate victory. He has assured our place that we will receive through his resurrection. We'll receive what he's already claimed for us, but we haven't got there yet. And we're stuck in that in-between, and we experience as a result a life and a world that is often marked by brokenness. And as much as we might want to insulate ourselves from the possibility of exposure to more difficulty or trouble, the bad news is that's not possible. We're going to all encounter stuff in the midst of our life. Even more, though, it's not what God promises or wants for us. He doesn't promise us a trouble-free life. If that's the version of Christianity that has been passed on to you, that isn't what we see here in Scripture or what we find throughout the story. So that's come home to me in a variety of ways, but I was reminded this week, and I've shared maybe in another sermon, that my family has often done a lot of road trips, whether it's driving to where we have family in Texas or over to Colorado or really kind of all over. And I said recently that our family enjoys road trips, and my daughter did correct me. She said, "Dad, we don't enjoy them. We've just learned to endure them." I was like, all right. I think we enjoy them too, but fair enough. Okay. Well, part of what happens when we get ready for a road trip is I have a bunch of checklists and I have planning, and I just like continually build upon it from trip to trip. And one of the things that I shared this week was I actually keep a little table of the times that we hit certain cities and markers along the road, and I race myself, and I have little splits in my Apple Notes. Now, as I shared this, I've realized not everybody does this, and I want to ask why. But I do it because it makes the trip go by, and it is in a weird way. I know it's super nerdy. It's kind of fun for me. Okay, so put aside my weirdness. At some level, what I'm really trying to do is I want the trip to go well. So I'm trying to plan, I'm trying to anticipate problems, and I'm trying to help this be a smooth process for everybody in the family. But what I've had to learn the hard way, and by that I mean my wife has told me this, is the biggest variable for how the trip goes is not going to be what the weather is like. It is not going to be how fast our lunch break is or how many stops we make along the way. It is going to be how I choose to respond to the inevitable, unexpected problems that happen on our journey. Something will happen that I didn't want to happen, and I can't plan that away. But my reaction, how I respond to whatever that unexpected problem is, that's probably going to be the biggest factor in how that experience is for me, for the people around me, for even those that are outside of my family. Now, you may not go on road trips. You may not even drive outside of Edina. You may not drive yet. But there will be things that happen in your life that you cannot anticipate or that you cannot control. If it hasn't already happened, something like this hasn't happened today already for you, consider it a good day. But there will be things, maybe things every day that will at least be inconvenient, if not even life-altering. And the good news for us as Christians is not that those things won't happen. They will happen, but it's what happens, what God has for us in the midst of them. Abraham obeyed God, left everything to go to the promised land, and then immediately there was famine. When that happens, because it will happen in all of our lives, pay attention to what or who you want to turn to, because it reveals which promises we are believing most in that moment. Do I think I can fix this problem? Do I think I just need more control? If everybody would just do what I say, this problem would get smaller, not bigger. How does it tend to go? Not very well. Second, the thing I think we see here in Abraham's story is that we need to be aware of our particular schemes and ways that we try to fix the famines or difficulties of our life. So Abraham thought he had found a way to manipulate his situation and create this good outcome that he wanted, right? So something I didn't say earlier, but I'm bringing it up now is, you see, Abraham actually he didn't tell a complete lie. He just told a half-truth when he said that Sarah was his sister. Sarah actually was his half-sister. They had the same father, but a different mother. And so in some sense, that's very strange to us today culturally, but it would have been something that would have been normal then. And in some way, Abraham is telling this half-truth to try to figure out a way of dealing with this. But the way that we know that this is kind of like looked down on, and even that Abraham's way of handling this isn't good, is that God doesn't just let this play out. God intervenes in this situation to protect Sarah. God intervenes to get them out of Egypt. And Pharaoh is actually the one who points out that what Abraham has done was deceitful and dishonest. And so it is out of the mouth of Pharaoh, with no rebuttal from a narrator or from Abraham, that we're reminded that this was Abraham trying to work his own way instead of trusting in God's way. Abraham fell back on his own resources rather than trusting in God in this decisive moment. And there's lots of ways that we can try to engineer outcomes too, okay? We think that if we can just get blank to happen, then I'm gonna get what I need or want in life. So if I can just get X job, then my life is going to go the way that I think it should or needs to or want it to go. If my kids would just do X, then they would find happiness, joy, a stable life, whatever that looks like. If I can just get the right grades and have the right extracurriculars and get into the right college, and then the dominoes follow, well, yes, maybe, but what I think we see in Abraham's story is that trying to engineer the outcomes that we want, it doesn't always bring the things that we actually need. One of our staff this week said in a worship meeting, he brought up that Home Depot has a slogan. I had forgotten about this, but Home Depot's slogan for do-it-yourself projects is, "You can do it, Home Depot can help." I would love to see them show up at my house to help me with some things a little bit more, but they still say this, at least you can buy it there. And I think a lot of the ways that we relate to God in these moments is we say, God, I can do it, but can you be on, speed dial? Can you help when it gets really bad? Instead of looking to Him. This isn't an easy. This isn't to say that we're called to just sit there and do nothing in the midst of really hard things, but what would it look like to take those things, those situations, those famines, those difficult situations to God first, rather than looking for our own ways to fix and solve those problems? That so often we have to realize that the poverty of our own resources, before we can draw upon the riches that God has for us. And so I was reminded this week of ways that what would it look like for me to take those things that feel very big, feel very hard to manage, feel hard to solve about my life right now, to God first? And I don't have to come with the plan that He can then sign off on, but just to say, God, I don't know how to love this person in my life right now. God, I don't know how to respond to this thing that is life-altering going on in my life, but you are not surprised by this, and you are not undone by this, and you can sustain us through this. What are those things in your life that you need to take to God in prayer? Third and final thing here is we see in Abraham's story, and we need to know for our own, that God's grace is at work to bring good out of our failures. So God spared greater pain for Sarah and Abraham in the way that He intervened in this story. He ensured that the promised family was protected. And we're going to follow that story of Abraham and his family a little bit more this summer. It said, we read that they entered Egypt under the weight of heavy or severe famine. But at the start of chapter 13, there's something interesting in what it says about Abraham and his family. As they leave Egypt and go back up into the promised land, they came under the weight of heavy famine, and they left, and the Hebrew word is the exact same Hebrew word. They left heavy with wealth that God had given them and that God had provided for them while they were in Egypt. In the midst of all that Abraham had got wrong, God did not abandon His promise. He didn't give up on Abraham. And in fact, when many hundreds of years later, God was introducing Himself to Moses in the book of Exodus, how does He introduce Himself? I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He identifies Himself with Abraham, who had all of these flaws and got it wrong in so many ways. It doesn't matter how many times you distrust God, how many times you choose fear over faith, and you walk in the cycle of distrust, God is not going to give up on you or me. We have and we will try to scheme and manipulate our way through situations in life that are hard, and yet God is going to be steadfast to His promises to you. We need to know that God's grace intervened, and we need to see how it intervened in the heart and life of Abraham. And we're going to see more of that in coming weeks. And God wants you to remember and see the ways that He's done that in your own story, and will continue to until you are more like Him. The happily ever after to our stories is not that we're going to be spared what is hard or difficult. It's that God loves us no matter what, and nothing is going to stop His grace from transforming us. So would you pray with me? God, we come feeling the weight of things